Hi, welcome to Module 2.4, Scheduling. As always, we'd like to thank CMHC for their support of this course through the project Community-Led Design for Specialized Housing in the North, and to acknowledge the partnership that makes this course possible between Nishnawbe Aski Nation, Together Design Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University, and the WASA Distance Education Centre. In this module, we hope to answer, what is a schedule? How do you make it? How do you share it? And how do you make sure that everyone is on the same page about the schedule? And what's contingency planning? And how does the assessment of risk in a schedule impact the schedule as a whole? This is about clearly identifying to everyone who's involved in the project what needs to happen and when. The important and challenging thing to understand about construction scheduling is that you have a lot of interrelated and overlapping activities. It's not an A to B to C simple schedule. You have a lot of things going on at once, and through this module, we hope to give you a sense of how you can keep track of them all and make sure that everyone else understands what needs to happen when as well. It's important to take a little moment to pause here and acknowledge that every project has some kind of a schedule. What we're talking about in this module is a formal scheduling system rather than an ad hoc or kind of seat-of-the-pants schedule. An important thing to realize in your role as project manager is that if you don't create the formal schedule, often what ends up happening is that somebody else is the one who's creating a schedule and you're operating at their whims. And that could be a contractor, it could be your funder, it could be someone else involved in the project. So making and operationalizing the project schedule is about creating transparency in project operations and making sure that you, in your role as project manager, are the one dictating when things should be happening and creating a clear sense of accountability within the project. It's important for the project manager to be realistic when preparing the schedule. There's a natural tendency to be overly optimistic when planning, and this leads to poor projections of time and costs. And this is something we're going to revisit throughout this module. While we do want a project to be completed on time and on budget, the way to do that isn't by being unrealistic and creating a plan that we know can't be followed. Identification and the classification of tasks is the first critical step where all individual tasks that together will make up the total construction process are listed out. Then, each of those tasks will be defined with a duration. So that's saying, how long is it going to take to get something done? And you can use a kind of variety of information and sources to make that guess. This is similar to when we've been doing budgeting work. It's not something you should just know off the top of your head. But this is, again, a great time to use your kind of professional network and past projects to gain an understanding. Then it's about the sequence of the tasks. Activities in a construction project may appear to be totally independent one from the other, but as you dig into it a little bit further, you're going to begin to understand how they're interrelated, how your plumber and your electrician, or as an example we'll see later shows, your plumber and your mill worker are closely connected. Making sure that those relationships and the sequence between those relationships is understood is one of the most critical parts of scheduling, and we're going to devote quite a few slides on that as we go. In larger projects, it also helps to identify tasks that can be completed or carried out at the same time. What are things that you can group together or batch so that you aren't flying someone up twice, for example, when they could get all of their work done on one visit? And that's why understanding the sequence is so important, and it is going to be a negotiation within the project team to get that sequence totally right. And then the last step is creating an overall calendar, the timeline, and we'll see a couple of different ways of doing that as we go through this module. So this first worksheet in the module looks at a really simple process of scheduling. And it takes the principles that we learned in the previous slide and just puts them on paper. In the left column, we've identified for you some of the tasks or the activities that will go into your construction project. And what I'm hoping that you can take the time to think about here and reflect on afterwards is how much time each of those activities takes and what is the sequencing. Now, as I said, you as the project manager, and particularly if you're coming to this role without a lot of experience in construction itself, but maybe with more of an administrative background, maybe you don't know these answers right away. That's fine. That doesn't disqualify you from being a construction project manager. But what I might encourage you to do now is look it up. See if you can find some of these answers, or at least some industry standard versions of these answers, and fill in this rough schedule. And where there's still holes for you, it's a great place for conversation with folks on your team or within your professional network to help you kind of fill in those gaps so that when you start your next project, you do have a bit of a leg up. A reminder, and this is a reminder I've offered earlier in this section in Module 2.1 when we were talking about engagement, as well as in Module 2.2 about design. While it is your responsibility as project manager to ensure that the schedule exists, that it's communicated in an appropriate manner to all the relevant parties, and also that you continue to oversee and adapt the schedule throughout the process, it is not your responsibility to make the schedule alone. And actually, I think making it alone would hurt the project. The scheduling process needs to, or really should, involve everyone who's going to execute it. You need their inputs. You need their understanding of how long things are going to take and what their proposed sequencing is in order to start putting this together. And if you don't take those inputs from your project team, you risk really alienating those critical members of the team when you just put out a schedule without their advice. Instead, getting to a final schedule, and that's something we're not going to get to for quite a few slides in this module, it's a process of negotiation, of taking all of those inputs from various contractors, inspectors, anyone else who's on your project team, and seeing how they can kind of fit together like a puzzle. One of the first components in a critical path method, and we're going to go through a couple, is constraints. What are things along the course of your project that can block progress, that can act as barriers to moving forward? And two examples you can think of here are a resource constraint and a scheduling constraint. A resource constraint might be that you can't undertake the next bit of work. Site grading was one of the ones that we had in the previous example, without the availability of a piece of heavy equipment. And maybe your community has the heavy equipment and a heavy equipment operator, but they're busy on another site or on another job. And that would be a resource constraint. You can also think here about needing a shipment with materials to arrive before a task can start. The second kind of constraint is a scheduling constraint. You can't start an activity until a previous activity has finished. And maybe you have a crew who's on site because they thought today was going to be their day to start framing, but the previous crew isn't done yet, and so they're not able to get to work. That would be a scheduling constraint. The other important aspect of critical path method, and we've talked about this a little bit already in this module, is sequencing. And there are 3 different types of sequences that are going to be used in building your critical path. The first, and the simplest to understand, is that you need activity A to finish before activity B can start. This is called the finish to start sequence. It's easy enough to understand. You need foundation inspection to have finished before floor framing can begin. This is the kind of most linear, straightforward example. The second example, which is a little bit more complicated, is start to start. Activity A must have started before activity B can start. An example of that is that window installation must have started before window trim can begin to be installed. So here, you don't need all of the windows to be installed before you can start your trim work, but you do need window installation to have begun. And you can begin to see with this example how this might impact your scheduling of different contractors or different labor. The last example, start to finish, is kind of the opposite of the first one. You need activity A to have started before activity B can finish. And I spoke about this earlier with the plumber and the mill worker. You need mill work to have started in order for the plumber to finish so that they can finish fixtures such as the sink and the faucet. That needs the mill work to have begun already. So using the 2 types of constraints and the 3 types of sequencing, we can now revisit our previous list of all of the activities and create a more precise and a more dynamic set of relationships that attaches each activity to subsequent activities. Now, as I've said, that's going to involve negotiation between each of the different players and teams involved in executing your construction project. And fitting together, as I alluded to earlier, a puzzle of when people need to be on site, when materials need to be on site, when equipment needs to be on site, so that you don't end up with any constraints and you do end up with the correct sequencing. Once you've done that, what usually ends up forming in critical path method as our kind of final plan is a map or a diagram that shows all of those relationships. And as I've said with other elements of planning and pre-construction, there's a lot of software out there, some of which your First Nation likely has access to, that can support you in building one of these visualizations. We're not taking the time in this course to teach software because there's so many and different folks will use different ones, but what you're going to end up with is something that might look like the diagram you see on screen here that details those different types of relationships and interdependencies and forms your project schedule. Now, I want to offer a couple of notes that make that schedule more usable. What you see is that a total project schedule can become quite large and complicated, a big document. And it's probably clear to you that there's a lot of conversations that you will have as the project manager with particular suppliers or contractors where you don't need the full project schedule for that conversation, but instead you need some kind of subschedule to frame that particular relationship. And so what you need to be able to do is extract from your total schedule different types of subschedules that speak to particular relationships that you as the project manager have. And 2 of these examples that we're going to talk about here is a schedule of materials or a schedule of resources. So a schedule of materials which documents or diagrams when you're going to need different materials on site is useful in coordinating with your suppliers and with freight to ensure that all the materials arrive at the correct time and that there's a really clear expectation about when things need to be on site. This is one of the most common constraints we see is that you reach a point in your project where the crew is ready to move forward, but the materials they need to be able to do that just aren't available yet. They're not in community. That's something I've definitely seen many times. And so having or pulling out of your total schedule a schedule of materials and making sure that that expectation is clear with the supplier, and also that the contractor has had input into that, or your crew who's building has had input into that, can really avoid unnecessary work stoppages and delays. Also, something like a schedule of resources, and to build off of an earlier example, thinking about when you need particular heavy equipment on site, it might allow you to coordinate with your public works team or whatever other capital projects teams are in your community to make sure that the equipment is available at the days and the times that you need it. So being able to pull out these sub-schedules is really important. And you can imagine something like this existing for different trades. There's lots of possibility for what sub-schedules you'll be able to build. Before we end, and we've now seen how to put together a schedule, I want to talk a little bit about how risk is handled in scheduling. And I know we've had a whole module about risk assessment and building a risk register, but I want to talk about how it impacts schedules. So we've discussed throughout this course that things don't always go to plan in construction. And so when you're building your schedule and thinking back to how much time each activity should be allotted, there is a tension that exists here. And I had the quote on screen earlier saying we shouldn't anticipate super fast timing for every activity, and that can lead to trouble. And so what you want to build in to avoid that is some contingency or some buffer. You don't want to assume that everything's going to get done in record time with no hitches. But when you're building in buffer, you also have to be careful to not add too much contingency. Because when you create your interdependencies map, if you've left too much buffer on a particular activity, that activity might get done, and then you might not have the next crew on site, the next materials on site, the resources you need on site until some days or weeks later. And what you end up with then is a kind of stalled project, and that can oftentimes end up costing more money and obviously delaying the timeline unnecessarily. So this is the real trick of scheduling. It's making sure that you have sufficient buffer without having unnecessary buffer in your schedule. And unfortunately, there's no kind of magic solution to that. I can't leave you here with saying this is the exact amount of buffer to add to every activity. Instead, it's something that you're going to figure out and get a feel for. And also, it's part of that negotiation with the whole project team. But what it really means is that your schedule can't be a document that you make once and that you walk away from. And instead, this has to be a living document that you continue to work on and adjust and make changes to, and importantly, continue that negotiation with everyone who's involved in executing the project throughout, so that it can be as precise as possible while still making sure that that buffer is there. So what we've learned in this module is really how to create the best first schedule that we can, but it's going to be something that you still have to continue to work on as you go. As always, here's some additional resources if you're interested in learning more about scheduling, and we'll see you in the next module.